Okay, so who remembers the Big Mac Index?
Isn't that the economists kind of joking?
Big Mac is a Big Mac.
Big Mac is Big Mac is Big Mac.
If the prices of Big Macs in various countries convert back to US dollars.
Okay, so yes, it was looking at prices of Big Macs around the world.
Started as
Yeah, it kind of started as a joke, and then they built something a little fancier. It's still kind of a joke because it's missing some things, but it does bring about the idea of purchasing power parity, which is an important long-run fundamental in the determination of exchange rates. So here's the kind of joke assumptions that go along with that. And they've actually adjusted for some of these assumptions, by the way. But so assume that we have a non-perishable Big Mac. There's a stretch.
I mean,
I
that
really
sounds
think
about
that's a
right.
stretch.
That's a good point, Chelsea. There's probably a little reality to that, isn't there? So non-perishable, no transportation costs. No transportation costs and no trade barriers. Those are just a couple of the assumptions that would be underlying this model of trying to explain this. And then, like I said, there are adjustments that can be made for some of that. So let's just work with those assumptions though. If the price of a Big Mac in the United States is currently $4.25, and so we're going to use this notation that I think is helpful. $4.25 per Big Mac. And the price of a Big Mac in Germany is $4.75. Nope, euros. So 475 euros per Big Mac. Under these restrictive assumptions, what's going on? What prediction would we make between these two prices here?
That you can
Yeah, how does the arbitrage business kind of work here? What would you predict that these two prices would be if this was Kansas and Missouri's price, and these were both dollars? What would we expect them to do? Merge and equalize, right? So that's called the law of one price, the law of one price. Now here, since we're dealing in different currencies, they're not going to merge. What's going to equalize them? The exchange rate. So the exchange rate's going to be the equalizer that gets us that same. Basically, identical goods should sell for the same price. Should sell the same price. So we can look at the relative price, which we did. In this case, it's identical goods, so this is slightly weird, but you might remember from principles class when we look at, well, what's the relative price of a Mountain Dew compared to whatever, a Big Mac or something. So if the Mountain Dew, it was dollars per Mountain Dew divided by dollars per Big Mac. And then what we effectively did was figured out how many Big Macs are effectively being traded for a Mountain Dew, right? That was called the relative price. So we're going to do the same thing here, looking at the relative price of these currencies, the price of the currency is the exchange rate. So we're kind of taking a similar step here by solving for E, which is the notation. I think I gave you a little e on the first one on Monday, but just to be consistent with the textbook, it's big E for this textbook, which might be difficult for me to remember. So with this, we're going to take the price in Germany divided by the price in the United States and see what we get.
Russ,
Yeah,
are you cooling down pretty good after that run?
I'm starting to, yeah.
Okay.
See the sweat coming down?
Yeah.
It's a little hot to begin with. Come on, it's not completely out of shapeness.
I mean, those are rough stairs.
Those are rough stairs.
That was 48 seconds, people. Come on. Remember, 43, you got a handicap here a little
Serious
bit.
about the stairs being
Let's
rough. I
say-
hate those stairs.
Let me take the
Say
pulse. Yeah, see,
But
it's
Chelsea
still at a
can't
rock
make
solid
400 meters at that amount of time. What's the
68
point?
right now. Quickly falling down to 60. Okay, so we take the price in Germany, the price in the US, and then add on our notation that kind of helps keep things hopefully straight for us. So this is euros per Big Mac, and then let's go ahead and put a little superscript G just to kind of remember that this is the Big Mac in Germany, if you want to think of it that way. And dollars per Big Mac in the United States. So fraction in the denominator, multiply times the numerator, solve for this thing. You got a calculator handy or phone on airplane mode. What do we get? Yes. And what are they? $1. Okay, now be careful. This expression is 1.12, right? 1.12, and then that's what I want to think about. Is it $1.12 dollars, or is it 1.12 euros, or is it what is it? Dollars per euro? Euros per dollar? Okay, that's why this notation comes in handy. Take the denominator, multiply times the numerator the good old-fashioned way. We get BM over dollars. BM's cancel because a Big Mac is perfectly substitutable. It's the same thing on perishable, blah, blah, blah. And then we get our euros per dollar. So it's 1.12 euros per $1. So it is indeed euros. It's the price of dollars expressed in euros. And that is the nominal exchange rate. Okay. Now, I want to introduce here the concept of the real exchange rate. So the real exchange rate is really what? What is the real, what's so real about it in this case? And I'll give you a hint, for this particular case, it doesn't deal with inflation like normal real things do a lot of times in econ.
Transaction.
Oh, we're still holding that fixed, but good thing to be thinking about.
Is it supply and demand in that market?
And it's what with supply and demand? And that might even be leading us astray a little bit. So the exchange rate is what for what? The nominal exchange rate, if you will. What we just solved for is essentially what for what? What are we exchanging?
Currency.
Currency for currency. So what's the real exchange rate? Good for good. Yeah. So it's what are we really, and that's what I did first with the Mountain Dew. If we think about Mountain Dew running $2, let me go back to this, $2 for every Mountain Dew, and the Big Mac is $4 for every Big Mac, then that means we have 2 divided by 4 is a half of what? It's a half of a Big Mac per Mountain Dew. What does a Mountain Dew cost me? Oh, that costs you half a Big Mac. We're dealing with the real quantities of the goods now, right? So that's what, in the context of international trade, the real exchange rate brings us back to reality in terms of the actual physical quantities of goods that are being traded. Okay? And ultimately, the purchasing power at a point in time for each country. So you can kind of think of what's my bang for my buck if I go travel to Australia, like some of you are doing. So if I have $100 to spend in the United States, what does my basket of goods look like? If I go to Australia with that $100, do the currency trade, go to the store and buy those goods, do I get more goods or less goods, right? That's kind of the real exchange rate. The prediction with the law of one price is that identical goods that are non-perishable with no transaction costs would be this one-to-one trade-off, that they would be effectively priced the same, meaning that the basket of goods would be exactly the same. I'd have 2 cans of Campbell's soup, 3 boxes of macaroni and cheese, a case of beer, and whatever else. In my shopping cart, the actual goods would run the same. What's that? Yeah, tariffs, taxes, and all that type of stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of things held constant that then ultimately drive that basket to be a little different. And that's, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but this is probably as appropriate time as any. We also might have a slightly different kind of jelly that we buy in Australia. I'm not talking Vegemite, but you know, a different brand of jelly that's domestically produced in Australia. We say the jelly in the United States, you know, they're pretty good substitutes with each other, but they're not identical goods. And so there might be other factors that are causing that price of jelly to be effectively 10 cents more in Australia than it is in the United States, right? So those are the sorts of issues that kind of drive us potentially away from this theory that leads to some different results. But in the long run, in especially developed countries, we expect that the purchasing power parity gives us pretty good predictions about interest rates. I'm sorry, about exchange rates. Okay, so the real exchange rate here is, we're going to do the same thing. The price of the Big Mac in Germany divided by the price of the Big Mac in the United States. But this time I'm going to convert the dollars in the United States to the other currency. So that now we're talking currency to currency. We've adjusted, we've kind of did what we did here with dollars. So, price of the Big Mac in Germany, 4.75 euros per Big Mac in Germany, divided by E, because we're going to convert our Big Mac. Sometimes I like to kind of think of it this way first. $4.25 per Big Mac in the United States, but now I'm going to apply the exchange rate of 1.12 euros for every dollar. Again, this notation kind of helps. These dollars cancel, and now we've got euro over euro. And what does this expression end up being? 1. Right? We're back to 1, which is kind of back to our prediction. When we're talking about identical goods, then we'd have, and then if you do the additional flip it over, we've got a Big Mac in the US over a Big Mac in Germany. It's a 1-to-1 trade. And that's really the real exchange rate when we're talking about identical goods, non-perishable, no transportation, no trade barriers. Okay. So, the extension of this then is to look at the theory of purchasing power parity as it relates to two countries' price levels. And this is where we get into, wait a second, the basket of goods are different. Some goods that are produced in the United States are not traded. What's not traded? What are some goods or services, kind of gives it away maybe, some goods or services that are not traded with other countries? Law, perhaps. Some of that could be exported or traded.
Children.
Local haircuts. How many exports does our local haircut place do here, right? So there's lots of possible goods that really aren't effectively traded. In other words, if haircuts are really cheap here and they're really expensive in Australia, they're not just going to buy our haircuts. Why? Because the transportation costs well exceed the benefits of doing it. So it's not going to work. So, in general, we apply KPP to all within a nation by the price level in each. So this expression for the nominal exchange rate, the spot rate if you will, since we're not talking about forward rates and whatnot, instead of the price in Germany over the price in the US, it's the price level in Germany over the price level in the United States. And I'm going to just put PL star. Yes, this is a PL down here. Yep. And so the star is kind of common notation in international economics. Your book here doesn't really use it, but international, oops, I meant to say international. I meant to say the foreign country. And this is the domestic country. So how the textbook does it is pretty common. Is since we're teaching this class in the United States, the domestic country will be treated as the United States as you kind of read things along. And then they've been inserting on different examples, sometimes Japan, sometimes Great Britain or whatever. And so whatever that other country is, it would be up here. And then we're going to get the same result when we think about the price level, that the exchange rate's now being expressed in euros per dollar. Okay, so let me throw one at you here. If our row country, rest of the world country, Germany if it is, so whatever, if rho does expansionary monetary policy, what will be the effect on exchange rates in the long run? Domestic currency appreciates?
Yeah, because it's going to drive up the price level internationally. Given this, we're assuming that domestic's going to stay constant.
Okay, so the textbook doesn't get into like expansionary monetary policy type issues because they wanted to allow some flexibility of instructors doing this section before maybe they've hit monetary policy and stuff. So I'm putting a little, you'll see this in the price level, but they don't give the monetary expansion part. But since we've been through that material, you guys have hit money and banking and stuff. Where does that philosophy come from? Somebody other than John? That, because he's right, by the way. So an increase in the money supply will lead to an increase in the price level in the long run, without John cheating too. So now Adam's out.
They don't even think he heard.
How do we know that expansionary monetary policy, why would we predict that expansionary monetary policy would lead to an increase in the price level? Just to go through John's explanation was this goes up, that leads to appreciation.
Because in an expansionary period, inflation rises.
Good, why?
Yeah, there's
More money in the system, right? Who predicted that? Who was kind of the leader of that? That was a Friedman theory.
Is that what you're wanting?
Yeah.
Oh.
So, well, no, I mean, that's fine. That's what I wanted to chase down so that you guys got some of the theories that were behind that. What was the theory?
Quantitative theory of money.
Yeah. The quantity theory of money through the equation of exchange. So that was the MV equals PY, where real GDP, the price level, velocity, the number of times a dollar gets spent, the money supply. Friedman's prediction was this is pretty much constant in the long run. Real GDP growth is going to be at its long run potential. If the government runs the printing press to pay for weapons of mass destruction or other things, government spending, things that go nowhere.
It's actually fairly accurate.
So if we increase the money supply, as you guys were saying, but it doesn't have any real effects in terms of productive assets that might be used to increase productivity, then those things will be inflationary. And if you do this by 10%, this goes up by 10%. That was really the heart of the quantity theory of money, is that changes in inflation will be proportionately matched with changes in the money supply. Okay, so that all ties in. The reason I wanted to spend a little bit of time giving you that background is that all ties into this exchange rate chapter pretty intensely, because this is an important concept here for long-run determination of exchange rates. And so monetary policy does play an important role. In the United States, do we have exchange rates as a primary concern? Is that one of the primary things that the Federal Reserve looks at and monitors and makes adjustments accordingly? Like, I want to appreciate the currency, I want to depreciate it, and they have these meetings and they're always talking about exchange rates. Is that the primary thing?
No.
No. What are the kind of the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve?
Inflation and unemployment.
Good, inflation and unemployment, right? Those are the two things that they tend to watch a little closer. Of course, they're keeping their eyes on all of that as it relates to those two things. But the exchange rate is freely adjusting in the marketplace, and ultimately is influenced in the long run, but not in the United States anyway, not in a direct fashion. Okay, we'll spend a little more time on that in chapter 21, but I think it's good to get some of that out. All right, questions or comments there? All right, so now that we teed up the long run, the text kind of goes through long run changes and then short run changes. And basically, purchasing power parity tends to be the dominating concept in the long run. And in the short run, there's other factors. So if you strictly rely on purchasing power parity, your prediction of what the spot rate's going to be or other forward rates is not going to necessarily be real well. The nominal exchange rate tends to fluctuate around or differently than what we would predict with purchasing power parity here with the exchange rate. So we can always calculate this after the fact, right? Like look at what the changes are. This is what the E would be if purchasing power parity held. And this is what it actually turned out to be. And then economists try to reconcile those differences with other factors. Katie?
So John was saying that when the foreign country price level rises, the exchange rate rises, is that right?
Yes, and so I guess I'm glad you brought that up because I meant to put that down here. So an increase in the money supply in the foreign country leads to an increase in the price level in the foreign country. We can put a little note here, quantity theory of money. And that was Uncle Milty, one of my favorites. And now we go back to the math up here. If the upstairs is getting bigger, then E is getting bigger. So that causes an increase in E, which is dollar appreciation. More specifically, or more generally, I should say, domestic country appreciation. Again, if you're thinking about the United States expressing it this way, then this going up means appreciation. And we talked about that on Monday, how you can be careful of which one's on top, which one's on bottom, because then that would flip around if we were making the domestic country be Japan, and all of a sudden the United States is the foreign country. That would be.
Although, like, in the book it says, like, in the long run, the rise in the country's price level causes its currency to depreciate. Is that what they
Right. So I'm going to do that next, Kitty, here. So I'm going to run through those factors. So factors that change E in the long run. So these are long run factors. Number one, domestic price level. An increase in the price level and I'm just going to rewrite what I have over there. You guys don't have to, but just kind of keep this formula in mind, and this will help out with some of this. An increase in the denominator makes the whole expression get smaller, so it leads to depreciation. In the domestic countries. Exchange rate. Number two, trade barriers. What's a trade barrier? Now this one I will go to Adam on, since he's the international expert. You got a pretty good score in that class, if I remember right. So I'm going to put you on the spot. So what are some trade barriers? There's multiple of them. Tariffs and quotas. Okay, so tariff is a tax on imports. So when we're bringing that Japanese car over at the border, we zap them with the tax. So the domestic, so now you got to start visualizing how these trade barriers are changing things here. We got little old Japan over here. And so at the border, they get zapped. So we're going to be thinking about domestic prices versus foreign prices. And so if we zap them with a tax, does that tend to raise prices in the United States or lower them? Raise, right? So those are the sorts of things going on with trade barriers. A quota is we're restricting what? The quantity. So in a free market, there'd be 1,000 Toyotas coming. Ford, GM, and Chrysler cry like babies, and they get the government to pass that only 500 can come in, right? So then that restricts the some of the competition within the United States and drives up prices. We're essentially restricting quantity. We're not going to get into the models of all of that with the international stuff, but you kind of got the gist of it. So that there's an increase in domestic prices is the key thing that goes on with trade barriers. Any other barriers you want to throw out there? What's that? Standards, restrictions. So we're not going to let a good come in unless you have met the high quality that us Americans do. If you're in a country, come on in, If you're in a country where you don't follow these environmental standards up to this level of parts per million, then forget it. You're not going to bring your good into my country, you dirty supplier that's hiring these people that are just not up to our standards. So we have trade barriers tend to raise the domestic price. So an increase in trade barriers, an increase in barriers okay, so an increase in barriers tends to lead to appreciation or depreciation. Barriers on the domestic side, good. So that's an important point here. This is domestic only. If you want to think about it, it's really domestic relative to the rest. So the rest of the world, similar in economics, holding all of the things constant. If we raise the trade barriers, then what's going to happen? So our price level, so prices domestically are going to go up for those traded goods. So when we have our goods going up, this one to me is a little tricky, and I don't think your book did a great case of this, so I'm going to try to justify it. It leads to appreciation of the exchange rate, and part of that is due to domestic prices getting higher because of the protection. And if, this is where your book didn't get into the details, which I appreciate. You pretty much have to spend a whole chapter, maybe even a part of a course on talking about this issue of, which we did in international, so get ready, I'm going to pick on you guys. Large country case versus small country case. So if you're the Bahamas and you do some trade barriers, you might not be influencing the exchange rate very much at all. It'll probably, because you're just a drop of water in the bucket. But if you're a large country, then you're going to be potentially changing prices. And so an increase in barriers tends to put upward pressure on the prices of the goods. And because of that, the exchange rate is going to be the mechanism that has that upward influence, and that's where we get the appreciation. The dollar becomes stronger against the foreign currencies. What happens to the, so the foreign currency has depreciated, right? And so how does that look to them? Do they like that? No, right? It's more expensive now for those goods, which is kind of what's tracking here with this. So the exchange rate is appreciating for the foreigners for the exchange process.
Wouldn't that end up destroying it for the goods anyway? Like, that would just make foreign goods look more appealing at that point, even though they've been buried out.
You mean foreign prices relative to ours?
Yeah.
Yes, but the catch is that we got barriers.
Right. No, I get
Yeah,
that.
yeah. So then us as Americans can't go out and buy their good because they're zapped at the border with the barrier. So that mechanism is all of a sudden broken down.
Right. I was just saying, doesn't that just basically compounds on its own failures, right?
Yes, it does. Yep. Yep. Okay. So number 3 is import demand. I'm going to go in the order that the textbook has them listed, even though I think this one is a little backwards to think about and kind of equally confusing. So, import demand. Who's importing? Is this? We are, right? So it's our demand for foreign goods. So if there's an increase in import demand, what would happen to the exchange rate?
The supply of dollars should increase, and the demand for foreign currency should also increase.
Okay, so
we should get a decrease.
So we'd end up getting a depreciation. All right, so that's correct the way you guys learned it in our class. And I'm just going to warn you guys especially, the other guys won't be as bad. They hold the supply fixed here for illustration purposes, which is okay for reasons I'm not going to get into because we'd spend the rest of the time talking about it. So what we can, what this is hinting at, because I think that's the most logical thing, and it's okay to think that way, that, and the rest of you too, if we demand more Japanese goods, we're going to supply the foreign exchange market with more currency, drive down the exchange rate, so that lead to depreciation. The way they've got it characterized, which by the way is sound, it's just a different way of looking at it, is through the relative demand for each one. And so I want to put a little extra note. They put it in words, but I think it's actually easier in notation. We can look at the relative demand, which is export demand, which is the next thing on our list. So if you want, you could put number 4, export demand. Export demand is what? Whose demand? Who's demanding what? Export demand. Foreign country wanting to buy our stuff. Chinese wanting to buy our chopsticks. That's one kind of weird example for those of you who didn't know that. We are an exporter of chopsticks to China. Isn't that weird? We, I think there's splinters come out from Louisville Slugger or something that we give them our chopsticks. So our export demand is this. And so the relative demand is export demand, demand for our exports, minus our import demand. I'll come back up to the top in a minute. That's why I said I think this one's kind of easy, I think. So if there's an increase in export demand, people want to buy more of our stuff, what happens to the exchange rate? It appreciates, right? So people want lots of our currency, and it tends to appreciate our currency. Now, once you are a believer in that one, which I think is more intuitive, we can come back up here and think about the relative demand. What happens to this expression? It doesn't necessarily go negative, but it gets smaller or bigger. Yeah, with an increase, with an increase in import demand, it gets smaller, right? So the demand shifts the opposite direction in here. And so that's kind of the logic that maybe helps you think of the relative demand of the currencies. And so an increase in the import demand leads to a decrease in this expression, a decrease in the relative demand, which to me helps my brain think about it being a depreciation.
And if you look at trade, I was going to say, if you look at trade barriers, for example, the quotas where they're not allowing things in, at this point you're asking for more things to come in, and so it's counterintuitive.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, anything else? Comments or questions there?
I mean, that's half of the model we were using last time. It's just
It is. They're just, yeah. And it does affect both sides of the market, and there's some other, like I said, there's a couple other nuances that I don't think are worth spending brain power on. Productivity. So what is productivity? Somebody other than John. John's been very helpful, thank you, but let's get some other action. Somebody who hasn't spoke yet. I want to hear what you think about productivity. People are being more productive. What are they doing? Oh, Michael nominates Jesse. Do I have a second? Oh, we have a second on the floor. Okay. What do you think? Productivity. If you are more productive with your studying, what does that mean? If you've been more productive on a given day, what does that mean?
I get more done.
Okay, and what have you done If you were more productive, like, wow, I was really productive that last hour of study, what did you do? You took a nap. Okay, you increased your knowledge in that given hour of time. You increased your knowledge by more than what you've done in the past, right? So you had an increase in productivity. Hopefully that'll lead to an increase in the higher grade, blah, 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 right? So we got that idea of productivity. Anybody else want to add to their idea of what you thought of when we think productivity? Chelsea, let me go Chelsea. I want to stay away a little bit from supply and demand and think more about production, almost at a micro level. Okay.
Increase your output.
Good. Increase your output relative to inputs. Good. That's always the thing, is one relative to the other. So if we take the number of output relative to the number of inputs, and that's where we were going with Jessie with her study time, for a given hour of study, she got more out of it for whatever reason. She was more productive. So number of units of output per unit of input. Now let me get a little bit back to maybe Chelsea's comment, is that when we are more productive, what happens to prices? They go down, right? So productivity is good. We can offer our goods at a lower price. If the United States prices are lower relative to the rest of the world, what starts to happen with an increase in productivity? We export more, they buy more of our stuff, right? So then we're kind of back up to this export argument. So productivity jumps, and again, this is more productive relative to the rest of the world. Again, all of this stuff is relative. So holding the rest of the world constant, if we're more productive, if there's an increase in productivity, that leads to a decrease in the price domestically, which leads to an increase in exports, if you want to take it down that route, and that leads to an appreciation of the exchange rate. Okay.
So like on that one you have a decrease in the domestic prices, which leads to like an increase in export demand and an appreciation of the increase in exchange rate, so appreciation.
Yeah.
So up on trade barriers, you have an increase in the prices domestically instead of a decrease, and it's leading to the same outcome.
Yeah, and the reason this has got the little devil in the details here is it's E times the price domestically, and so it's actually E that's bringing up the price because of the barriers. And down here, by the way, there's also a little bit of a distinction that with traded goods versus non-traded goods that the book talks about, so there's a small thing here, but I think this is the way my brain plays out with this, and it's consistent. Some of the stuff I like to tell good stories. This one I struggled with coming up because they left out the whole large country, small country, and I had to kind of think about how this looks relative to the world. And so the increase in price is actually to the foreigners, the price that they face, not the price domestically. So the price, and I should clean that up a little bit. This is really what I'm increasing.
So when variables like people right.
Right.
It was just a notation since they were.
Yes. Yep. No, that's a good thing to point out. Okay, folks. That's a wrap for today.
So we're going to discuss any chapters.